The dust hadn't even settled under the black flags of ISIS and al-Qaeda in downtown Damascus, the longest continuous capital city in the world, before Israel began a rampage, bombing everything in sight. Hundreds of bombing raids on a country now bereft of a government that the apartheid regime said they abhorred. Nothing stands in the way of the Greater Israel Project in Syria now. They have seized still more Syrian territory. They have destroyed comprehensively any self-defense mechanisms, systems, and weaponry held by the Syrian state. The Syrian state effectively no longer exists. Whether it will be put back together must be a difficult calculation. It is, after all, the case that no cross-sect power exists in the land, at least not with guns. The beauty of the Syrian Arab Republic was that it defended all the communities within the boundary of Sykes-Picot's Syria. Syria used to be much larger. Syria used to include Jordan, used to include Lebanon, used to include Palestine. All of that was taken away. And now the Ottomans are back. The Turkish flag flies on the citadel in Aleppo, not seen since Lawrence of Arabia helped drive them out, with the assistance and with the strength of Syrian Arab nationalism. The Turks are occupying a part of Syria. The Americans are occupying a part of Syria. And now Israel will take any part of Syria that it decides to take. All of these are the inevitable consequences of the collapse of the Syrian state, with just a tiny push, almost bloodless, hardly a shot fired in its defense, which is, I'm sorry to say, testimony to the hollowed out nature and character that Syria had become. If your regime disappears overnight with nobody prepared to fight for it, nobody prepared to die for it, then your state has come to the end of its useful life. The question, therefore, is what kind of Syria will now succeed it? Will the rebranded HTS, although still listed as a terrorist organization by both the United States and the United Kingdom, will they be the leopard that changed its spots? Will they cease and desist the murder of religious minorities, including the Christian religious minority? Will they stop harassing women? Will they stop public executions in the squares of Idlib, of Aleppo, and many other places in Syria? It's the case that we don't have to look in the crystal ball to see what kind of people they are. We can read the book of their previous achievements, of head chopping, throat cutting, heart and lung eating, mass murderers of religious minorities, and even people of their own current of religious thought, who deviated 1 millimeter from that decreed by the leaders of al-Qaeda and ISIS. The man who is now effectively in charge of Syria is from both schools of thought. He was the number 2 to al-Zarqawi, the al-Qaeda leader in Iraq. That means he killed a lot of folks. He killed a lot of American folks, killed a lot of British folks. He killed a lot of Western journalists. He killed a lot of ordinary Iraqis just because he didn't like their religious stripe. When he was done in Iraq, he moved to Syria and became the number 2 to al-Baghdadi, the founder of ISIS in Syria. So we have now successfully put in charge of the Syria that we knew, that history knew for millennia, a man who was number 2 in al-Qaeda and then number 2 in ISIS. The Western journalists are all celebrating. They say that these individuals that head the HTS have moderated. They've seen the value of diversity. Next, they'll be appearing under a rainbow flag. Who knows? Well, I've never seen a leopard that changed its spots, but I'd like to. I hope that the Syrian people have a brighter future, but I doubt it, and so should you. You've come to the right place to argue all of this out, here on Have It Out with Galloway. Professor Seyed Mohammad Marandi of the University of Tehran has emerged as one of the clearest and most wise voices coming out of the region. That's why he's our guest on Have It Out with Galloway. Professor Marandi, thank you for joining us. Before we look to the future, let's look, if we can, to the recent past. Lots of reports emerging today that Syria could have been saved if the president of Syria had been prepared to stand and fight. If the president of Syria had been prepared to allow his allies to come and defend him. If these reports are true, why do you think he made that decision?
My understanding is that he changed his position more than once. And by the time he decided to take a stand, it was really too late. And there was nothing that could be done. And although it is easy to blame the president or the former president of Syria, I think what we really should take into consideration more than anything else is the fact that the United States and its European allies carried out a dirty war since 2011. We know from the Jake Sullivan email to Hillary Clinton on February the 12th, 2012, where he said, Al-Qaeda is on our side in Syria. We know from the Defense Intelligence Agency document of 2012 that U.S. allies in the region wanted to create a Salafist entity between Syria and Iraq. And of course, that Salafist entity was ISIS. And we know that the head of that organization, General Michael Flynn, he said that Obama supported this policy that was being pursued by oil-rich regimes in the Persian Gulf, and Turkey, unfortunately, as well as Jordan. And then we know that Kerry, in a leaked audio, said that the United States, not only did they pay billions of dollars to for these extremists, but he also said we allowed ISIS to advance on Damascus. So it's quite clear that the United States crushed Syria and the U.S. and its allies and regional countries. And then in addition to that, they imposed the Caesar sanctions. That crushed the economy as well. So they impoverished the whole of Syria. And then to add insult to injury, they occupied northeastern Syria, where we have the agricultural territory and the oil. So the U.S. steals the oil. Trump himself said we're there for the oil, and they steal the grain. So they starved the Syrian people. They've destroyed it through a dirty war. They steal the assets. And I think that under such circumstances, after a period of time, society wears down. And my concern now is that we may see the same thing happen in Cuba, as well as in Nicaragua. And the attempt to do the same thing is, I think, is clear in Venezuela. So the United States is using dirty war and sanctions to bring down countries. As the U.S. declines, it is using the two tools that it has as its weapons. One is the financial institutions, and the other is the military.
So the big winner, there are several big winners in this, this event. One is obviously Turkey, which has supported these Takfiri forces right from the beginning. One is obviously Israel, which is making good on its greater Israel dreams. Right now, as we speak, advancing further and further into Syria, destroying more and more of any potential future military infrastructure to defend the country. But the big winner is the United States. Now, you say it's declined, and I'm frequently guilty of that myself, but it doesn't look like it's in decline today. You're a professor of American studies. Have we not overestimated the rate of decline of the American empire, and definitely overestimated the speed and strength with which the new world is going to be born?
Well, I'd like to point out that I don't think that this is a win for Turkey. I think it's a catastrophe for Turkey. I think it's a win for Erdogan and his ego. But the burden of Syria is going to fall on the people of Turkey. And I have no doubt that al-Qaeda in Syria is not going to make it a better place. And right now, as you rightly pointed out, the Israeli regime is bombing Syria day and night, occupying new territory, and we see no condemnation from al-Qaeda in Syria or its boss, Jolani, and we see no condemnation from Erdogan. So Syria is being plundered. We've seen the central bank plundered yesterday. We've seen government institutions plundered. We've seen government buildings burnt down. It's going to get worse, and Turkey is going to have to deal with both extremism. They've trained up to 20,000 foreign fighters from Central Asia, the Arabic world, between 3,000 and 5,000 from China, Uzbekistan, large numbers of Uzbeks there. This is going to cause a lot of trouble. But I do think that Netanyahu and Erdogan are winners, but I think Turkey is a loser. The biggest loser, of course, is the people of Syria. But I agree, the United States also wins, in a sense. But I don't think in the long run the United States wins either. The United States, this policy is bad for the United States. We now have a country controlled by al-Qaeda, and that means global instability, global threats for terrorism will rise. But the United States and the Europeans, as we've seen in Gaza, are willing to sacrifice their interests for the sake of the Israeli regime. And this is just another example of that. But I agree with you. The United States does continue to be the global superpower. But in relative terms, it is declining. Yet that does not mean it does not have the power to cause great harm and to cause great suffering, which it does regularly across the world. And as we see in Lebanon and Gaza, all the weapons that the Israeli regime uses, all of the ammunition, the financial assistance, the political cover, the military, the media support, all of it comes from the West. And at the top of the list is the United States.
Well, the New World, the leading powers in the New World, weren't able to do anything to stave off the coming to power of al-Qaeda and ISIS, even though they had formal agreements. I mean, I am so old, I remember when Syria signed the friendship treaty with the then Soviet Union. The Russians have got a naval base there, although how long it will last must be debatable. They had an air base there. They had forces there. They played an important role in staving off collapse on earlier occasions. China, which endlessly churns out press statements about noting with concern events here and there, neither of those was able to do anything or willing to do anything to save their ally. Why is that?
I think there are many reasons. China is a country that is still cautious about uh, making big moves in the political arena. And even as they enhance cooperation with Iran and Russia, they like to do it very quietly. And in the case of Syria, the Chinese have been very cautious. And that is something that the Americans benefit from, because the Americans are very straightforward and very blunt about their policies and carrying them out. But I also think the biggest problem is that the United States continues to have a hold over the financial institutions that are used globally. And of course, the US dollar plays an enormous role. We saw the BRICS summit, which you participated in, or at least you were in town when it was taking place. A lot of people had great expectations. I think those expectations were a misunderstanding of the reality on the ground. The change is not going to take place overnight, but this is the biggest problem. Countries that the United States chooses to strangle, they cannot breathe easily. Right now, Cuba, over the past few weeks, it hasn't had electricity for most of the time. People have to walk kilometers every day to get to work. Is Cuba a threat to the United States? Is Cuba a danger to the United States? Of course not. It is a poor, small island off the coast of Florida. Yet the United States continues to impose barbaric sanctions against the country because they want to crush it, to show that this is our backyard. So as long as the United States has the ability to do this, and as long as other countries do not have mechanisms to do business and trade without using US controlled and dominated financial institutions, or the US dollar, I think that this problem, this dangerous situation will continue for other countries that are being targeted by the United States. And this is something that ultimately I think China has to be very concerned about, because the United States is trying to, one after another, take out countries through sanctions. Everyone says that sanctions don't work, but they do. In the case of Syria, we saw how they worked.
Now, we've talked about who are the winners. My pick of the biggest loser after the Syrian people themselves, the Syrian women, the Syrian Christians and other religious minorities, they're the biggest losers. But after them, it seems to me obvious that the biggest losers are the Palestinian people. Is their ability to resist now at such a point that they might as well sue for peace?
Well, George, you know the Americans better than I, and you know the Israelis better than I. Whenever people sue for peace, they get nothing. The Israelis have never given the Palestinians anything, and they will not give the Palestinians anything now. Unfortunately, Erdogan's betrayal of the resistance turned what was, I believe, a major victory, despite the heavy costs for the Palestinian people and for the people of Lebanon, and for the Syrians who were regularly bombed. And that is another problem. The Syrians were being constantly bombed by the Israeli regime in order to weaken the resistance. But despite that, it was a victory, because the Israeli regime was isolated across the world. It was despised. It's viewed by many as no longer legitimate. It failed to win the war, and as a state with stated objectives, or as a regime with stated objectives, it didn't achieve any of them. But with the collapse of Syria, and we saw Netanyahu speak, and we saw Biden speak. They took credit for the collapse of Syria, and he Netanyahu was very open that it was in his interest. He said we weakened Hezbollah, so and that brought down the regime, and he was very happy. And from what I'm hearing from friends who know a thing or two about Israel, inside Israel, people are very excited about the situation. So it's a fact that Netanyahu scored big on the collapse of Syria, and the betrayal of Mr. Erdogan, who refused to break off ties with the Israeli regime over the past 14 months, refused to end the oil trade. He's been sending cheap oil from Baku and Central Asia during these 14 months, even after Netanyahu and the former genocidal defense minister were declared guilty by the ICC. He still refused to end the oil trade. And of course, other trade continues with the regime, even though he denies it. But Erdogan is, I think, the most important ally of the Israeli regime in the region.
Professor, thank you for laying the foundation for our discussion now with the studio audience. I thank you, as always, Professor Mohammad Marandi. Now let's take some important guests on the screen. Father Frank Gilly is in London. Father, you must be concerned about the holy places in Syria, about the Christian communities who have suffered so grievously from previous iterations of the Al-Qaeda-ISIS phenomenon in Syria.
Yes, I'm indeed, George, and I'm glad that you made a reference a moment ago to the plight of the Christians. Yesterday, when the news came of these, in inverted commas, liberators entering Damascus, I was, of course, reminded of, in the New Testament, St. Paul on the road to Damascus had a revelation, and he came eventually to Damascus and was transformed from a persecutor of Christians. He became a messenger of love and peace. But so I'm concerned, and of course, it's remarkable how Western leaders and the media, of course, hardly touch upon the role of minorities. We only hear about minorities, but we do not really, it doesn't get reflected on this occasion about the news from Syria. The news from Syria is usually fairly one-sided and monochrome. But anyway, what I wanted to ask you originally was, you already, as well as Professor Morandi, in your own wonderful introduction, have pointed out how really, it looks as if Netanyahu is a big winner. He was boasting last night about we've done it. We have toppled Assad thanks to our actions in Lebanon against Hezbollah and so on. Now, my question very simply is this. Do you think Iran will be next? Because the Zionists have succeeded in weakening their opponents in Lebanon, now in Syria, and it seems so. And poor Gaza, I feel like crying every moment I think about it. Do you think Iran will be next?
Well, the only barrier to Netanyahu's greater Israel project now, for this moment in time, things can change, is the tender sensibilities of Western liberal regimes. They're the only people who could stop Netanyahu now. And as we've seen over the last 14 months, they seem to have an almost limitless tolerance for whatever crime Netanyahu wants to commit. For the moment, the axis of resistance is broken because, of course, it relied upon Iran and its transmission belt through Syria, which is now broken. And so the resistance in Lebanon has been left high and dry. The resistance in Lebanon was the only armed entity confronting the Israeli occupation of Palestine, trying to limit the pressure on the people of Gaza. Iranian weapons are the weapons in Gaza that were in the hands of the resistance for the next period at least. That will be no more. There will be no more material flowing from Iran into Palestine, not just Gaza, but also the West Bank. So Netanyahu can do what he likes for the immediate future, and that immediate future might be quite a long one. So he's riding high. Just because we hate to say that doesn't mean we can't conclude it. He's riding high. And all those who are celebrating what happened this week in Damascus have to ask themselves, if Netanyahu is cheering along with you, are you sure you should be cheering at all? And a remarkable number of people are unable to grasp these undeniable facts. Iran is too powerful for Israel to confront on its own. They would need the United States to become involved in an all-out war against Iran. And I very much doubt that the United States is ready for that. But Iraq might be a different kettle of fish. The current balance of power in Iraq could be disturbed by new American aggression. I see that the British Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, celebrating the downfall of dictatorship in Syria on his visit to Saudi Arabia. I make no further comment on that. He has promised that Britain is going to play a much bigger role in the Middle East, henceforth, after the fall of the Assad government in Damascus. Well, many in Britain will be asking if we don't have more than enough problems at home that the Prime Minister should be addressing, and others will be asking more British involvement in the Middle East. What could possibly go wrong? Curtis Hinton is a TV host in London. Curtis, welcome. What do you want to say?
Thank you, firstly, for having me. I want to ask if Israel don't get a wider win here, and the liberators do remain in charge in Syria, do you think Sir Keir Starmer and the future government should, firstly, take them off the terror list? And secondly, should we negotiate with them? Should we have treaties with them, ties with them? I mean, if they are now going to make the Syrian people happy, as they supposedly claim they're going to, do you think that we should be opening conversations with them? Obviously, I know Starmer said now that we're going to be, or are going to be more involved in the Middle East, but do you think that there's wider scope for international relations?
Yes, I do. I might surprise you in saying. You have to deal with the people who are in control of a country. And this ISIS, al-Qaeda front is in control of Syria. So you can't wish that away. You can only deal with what's in front of you. Paul had a remarkable conversion on the road to Damascus. Maybe the Golani-led HTS, which is simply a renaming of ISIS and al-Qaeda, maybe he will have a conversion too. You have to keep an open mind, but you have to report things accurately. If Christians start to be murdered, if women start to be marginalized and terrorized, if religious minorities start to be murdered in the way that these people murdered them just a few short years ago. We're only talking 7 years ago, 6 years in some cases, since these people were cutting the throats of journalists live on television. So we should sup with a long spoon to be sure. But of course, Syria is an important country. The region is important to everyone. Don't forget that Jesus walked in Syria, that places like Malula are in my view, the holiest places on the earth. Syria is the only place in the whole world still speaking Aramaic, the language of Jesus. Of course, we have to be engaged if we can. But if these former Al-Qaeda, ISIS leaders have not changed their spots, then it will undoubtedly give rise to civil war. The people that they're terrorizing will rise up against them, and they will find friends and allies around the world, and even more instability and horror and blood will occur in Syria. I genuinely pray that that does not happen, but it might happen, and we have to keep a very, very sharp eye on it. Thanks for your call. Patricia Talib, our good friend of the show, is in Lebanon to give an update of reaction in the region. Patricia, tell me, what do you think the impact of these seismic events is likely to be on Lebanon?
Hello, George. Lovely to be here again. In terms of reactions, I think the reaction has been very mixed. And I think that's to a huge extent due to ignorance and a lot of emotions and a lot of American propaganda in the media. But the majority of people realize the threat of these groups coming to arise. In terms of the effects that this could have on the region, it's really, really horrifying. We absolutely have faith in our resilience and our resistance, and the morale in general is high up until now, and probably till the end of time amongst the people and the atmosphere of the resistance and the families of the resistance. But it's something that I think was almost like a joke. It was unbelievable. The way that they started rebranding Al-Julani and the way that everything happened, maybe a day after the ceasefire, they started moving, and how quickly they took the country was insane. So it was something that we know was backed by the entirety of the world once again. They only seem to like armed resistance really when it serves, we deem it as armed resistance only when it serves the imperialist interests in the Middle East.
The only people who were supporting the Palestinians in Gaza were the Lebanese resistance, Iran, and the people of Yemen, very far away and with very limited resources at their disposal. That's all going to be very, very much more difficult now, isn't it?
It is. It's going to stop. They need to find a new way in which to get weapons. And after the war that we've come out from, it's quite brutal. The first few days of the war, a lot of weapons were damaged. A very huge amount of weapons were damaged. They did manage to use a lot of intelligence, the Zionist entity in this in last war. So definitely Hezbollah needed a moment to breathe and to be able to restore its capabilities to the max. And to the way that they once were. And this, whatever's happening, it's going to result us to separate. But ultimately, that this is not going to be an issue for the resistance, because every single problem that we've been faced with, we know that the resistance is going to solve. But this is a massive, massive, massive blow to the resistance. And the likes of Erdogan and the people that share those stories actually have dealt a horrible, horrible, horrible blow to the resistance in Gaza and to the axis of the resistance in its entirety.
Patricia, the line is bad, but your message is clear and your heart is strong. I'm always grateful to you. Lorena Cervantes is in Vigo in the northwest of Spain. Lorena, what would you like to say?
Hello, Mr. Galloway. I hope you're doing well. You will see that I have in my background the real flag of the Syrian Arab Republic. We are seeing here in Spain everyone from journalists to political authorities claiming this is a victory for the people of Syria. Imperialist powers doing what they know best. I would like to ask you about the involvement of Turkey and Erdogan in this event happening in Syria. So, what's the real role of Turkey?
Well, I think that Erdogan, as Professor Marandi said, is the principal driver, and him personally, one of the principal beneficiaries, though, as the professor said, the people of Turkey may have quite some time to regret the role played by Erdogan in Syria. But his enmity towards the Syrian people, and indeed towards, let's face it, towards the Arabs in general. You know, there are a large number of people inside his political current, inside Turkey, who've never forgiven the Arabs for rejecting their 400-year Ottoman Empire. And Erdogan would quite like to be the new emperor. And so he acts out many of these imperial fantasies in the way in which he assisted from the very beginning the very worst elements that he would never tolerate in Turkey. He nonetheless saw no problem about funneling them, literally funneling them, carrying them in his own vehicles with the active compliance of his own forces into creating murder and mayhem in Syria. It seems to me there are many people, whether they're too young to remember, I don't know, and maybe I'm getting old, but have people forgotten what ISIS and al-Qaeda were doing just a few years ago, and not just in Iraq and Syria? Have you forgotten what they did at the Bataclan? Have you forgotten what they did in the Manchester Arena? Have you forgotten what they did in European capitals, in German Christmas markets, in throat-cutting acts of vile terrorism all over the world? Has that really all been forgotten? If it has not been forgotten, why are our governments, your government in Spain, my government in Britain, why are they acting so pleased at people who are throat-cutting and eating people's hearts on camera just a few years ago? Why are the Western governments and the Western media so apparently pleased that finally ISIS have got a state to themselves? Go figure. Anglo, not his real name, he's up next. Anglo, how can I help you? What do you want to say?
Thank you for having me, George. So I know we've had some pretty significant developments in Syria this week, and we know that for a long time this is part of the grand strategy of Israel to break up Syria, and the next target will be Iran, which involves my country, Canada. Our former Attorney General and Justice Minister, Erwin Kotler, was allegedly threatened with an assassination plot by the Iranian government that was revealed to a Canadian journalist, a prostitute, one would say, Robert Fife, from an anonymous source. And this resulted in Erwin Kotler meeting with our Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, to discuss implementing our new IRHA handbook guide in Canada. And this is part of a grander strategy that not just involves the Middle East and overthrowing the governments there, but involves total system capture of Western democracies by implementing a new IRHA guide, which will eliminate the ability to criticize the actions of the state of Israel. And I could go into details about that.
Well, you don't need to, I think, because I'm fully seized of what's happening. But that's because I'm interested in Canada. But I've got to break the news to the Canadian people that I very much doubt if Iran gives a single moment's thought to Canada, let alone to their Attorney General, let alone to even their Prime Minister. Canada has an inflated sense of its importance in the world. It is a fly on the back of an elephant. And yet the politicians in Canada and the media in Canada, the prostitutes that you refer to, constantly come up with these fantasies that China is thinking about them, obsessing about them, planning against them, that Russia is, that Iran is. The truth is Canada ain't worth a row of beans. And it's important that the Canadian people end this narcissistic obsession by imagining that anyone anywhere is plotting to kill their here today, gone tomorrow pygmy politicians. Malik Naim is in Germany. Let's hear from Malik. What do you want to say, Malik?
Hello, Mr. Galloway. I've been watching local television and have seen that the Syrian people are really rejoicing and dancing all over the place, and they're saying they have been freed. And I'm wondering, what are they happy about? Have they forgotten what ISIS did to all in previously? And secondly, I feel that Syria has fallen, and does that mean that Palestinian can be taken to graveyard?
Well, I did ask that question of the professor earlier. It's undoubtedly one of the possible outcomes. Of course, there are many Syrian people rejoicing, some of them because they're afraid of what will happen if they don't rejoice. The idea that Syria is now a free country is, of course, an obscene fantasy. How free can you be with the former deputy head of both Al-Qaeda and ISIS as your new ruler? So there are many people who will be dancing on cue for fear of what might happen if they don't. But there were large numbers of Syrians who hated the former regime there. Many of them are abroad, and they will now need to return to Syria. We can't have a situation where people who got political asylum in Western countries because they hated Assad now remain in those Western countries when Assad has gone, and they are, in fact, out on the streets of Western countries celebrating. Well, good luck when you return to Syria, as you must now all do. There will, of course, be quite likely a flow of refugees, new refugees. It's good that the political prisoners in Syria are now being freed. But those jails will soon be filled with new political prisoners. As sure as night follows day, that's what's going to happen. But the Palestinian question is now an open question, the one that you raised. That's why I asked it of the professor. It's very difficult for me to even utter those words, but there's a very real possibility that Palestinian resistance will be impossible from now on, with no means by which those who love Palestine and support it can convey in concrete practical ways that solidarity that they feel. Netanyahu has already ethnically cleansed the whole of the north of Gaza. Right at this moment in time, he could sweep everyone in the south of Gaza into Egypt and nobody would stop him. They're not even reporting Israel's bombing of Syria today. Not even reporting it, never mind condemning it. So Netanyahu could, at this moment, might not last, but at this moment could do virtually anything that he liked. And that's a very dangerous position for the world to be in. Dennis Ballantyne is from New York. Let's hear a voice from stateside. Go ahead, sir.
Hello again, George. Thank you again for having me and for your continuing work and all the goodness that you bring.
Thank you.
In all of this darkness, and there is certainly enough of it, I still try to find some hope, some positive aspects of this. So I'm just going to share what I think are a couple of those. First of all, I have always felt that until and unless Putin reconciled himself to the fact that Erdogan needs to be dealt with forcefully, that the situation was just going to be prolonged. I think that Erdogan has sealed his fate with Putin now. And as important as the Bosphorus is to Russia and their access to the Mediterranean, I think the Russians have contingency plans, and I think that's my message today. It's a message of hope. The Russians are organized, they're deliberate, they're very calculating. They have contingency plans, 4 contingency plans. We're not going to get out of this without a fight. It should be enough for people to know that Erdogan a couple days ago in a press conference said that there are only now 2 leaders in the world, he and Vladimir Putin. Netanyahu took credit for the destruction of the Syrian state. If you argue, which I do, that all Israel can do now, the only thing that Israel can do now is compound its situation and make it worse than it already is as far as Israel's relationship with the rest of the world is concerned.
Well,
so
everything you said up to that point, I agreed with everything. But I take issue with your last point. You say that Israel's situation can only get worse. But in fact, Israel has scored an amazing victory. Netanyahu, who looked dead and buried, is now the cock of the walk. And those who helped him become so should be ashamed of themselves. If you've got a Palestine flag in your bio and you are rejoicing at the destruction of the Syrian state, you were either lying in the first place or you're a first-class idiot. Because a blind man can see what a devastating blow to the Palestinian cause the events in Syria this week have been. And so Israel will do what it likes for the short-term future. No one can stop it. Putin is not Superman. Russia is not the USSR. Russia's hands are full fighting all of NATO in its own borderland of the Ukraine. Don't imagine that Russia is in a position right now to deal with Erdogan and Turkey forcefully. Russia is fighting for its very existence right now. And if we're not fortunate, Iran will have to fight for its very existence. Stop overestimating ourselves and stop underestimating the strength and the wickedness of our enemies. Sorry for all those who didn't get on the show today. I promise we'll do our best to put you on next week. At the same time, in the same place, I'll be here. Have it out with Galloway.